Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, dear audience. A warm welcome to Living Humanity, the Congress about war crimes, universal rights, and the future of jurisdiction. First of all, please allow me to express my thanks to many different people who have made this Congress possible. Dr. Dickert of the Higher Regional Court in Nuremberg, Mr. Husemann, I should like to thank them for making this wonderful location available to us, which makes it possible for us to meet here in this impressive room. I should like to thank them for their openness and their hospitality. I should also like to thank the team of the Higher Regional Court Nuremberg who have supported us in the past few weeks. I should also like to thank our second cooperation partner, Natalia Pyronitska from Open Platform. Thank you. I thank our experts, human rights activists, lawyers and scientists who have traveled from afar in order to get here. I thank my team of the project group Eastern, Central and Southeastern Europe for their dedicated work, for their ideas and inspirations. I should like to name them: Katharina Mischenko, Anna Dedius, Hanna Süchtinek, Konstanze Söder, Christina Menke, Katharina Bergs, Caroline Savchuk and Matthias Kanya. My thanks also go to our press team, Tamina Kutscher and Mandi Ganske-Zapf, and our interpreters who will take us through the next 2 days and ensure communication. I should also like to thank you for coming here and for your interest. Ladies and gentlemen, living humanity, according to Hannah Arendt, becomes possible only if there is a thinking space in which we can confront reality. Our Congress is such an opportunity to confront the crimes of war and their jurisdiction. Here we are assembled in the historic Hall 600, where universal human rights were upheld and where milestones of international law were created. This meant an end to the impunity of war crimes and of crimes against humanity. Never again, this is what people said here and what was stated here. An architecture of international jurisdiction was created and developed, which subjected wars to the laws of humanity and of human conscience. But where do we stand today? This never again has developed into an ever and ever again. The wars and armed conflicts that are currently ongoing in Europe and in 4 other continents challenge the worldwide security systems and international law. In the 21st century, the destruction of people, infrastructure and nature is something that we can witness in real time, but so far there are hardly any effective initiatives of the major international organizations in order to put an end to this destruction. The Congress, Living Humanity, creates a thinking space with human rights activists, lawyers, thinkers and journalists and you. It's a space where we can discuss how global institutions work in the face of these challenges. How does the jurisdiction of, against war criminals function today, and how are the voice of the 20th century related to the present-day conflicts? We wanted to get engaged in action on the basis of solidarity in order to shape the future in subjectivity in Europe and in order to come up with an alternative to the disruptive reality that we are faced with. What can I do? Do not get engaged in premature obedience. Defend institutions. Accept responsibility and ownership for the face of the earth. Be careful if you are authorized to carry an arm. Believe in truth. Challenge and verify things. Get engaged in eye contact and conversation with others. Learn from like-minded people in other countries. Get engaged for good purposes. Be as courageous as possible. The historian and intellectual Timothy Snyder has some other lections in his book about tyranny in times of disruptions, hesitancy, and fear. Let me conclude with a quotation from Hamlet, with which Timothy Snyder ends his lectures. "The time is out of joint, O cursed spite, that ever I was born to set it right." Now, come on and let us go together. Thank you very much. Well, dear guests who have come here from afar, as the host, our co-host of this Congress on Human Rights, which is organized by the Federal Agency for Civic Education, I should like to welcome you to the most famous courtroom of the world, Hall 600. You could not have chosen a more appropriate room, because this room is a place where world history was written. Indeed, it's a place where fundamental principles of international law were developed. I should like to welcome you to this important event here. In order to give you a feel of this building and of this room, I should just like to say a few words about the history of our Palace of Justice and of this Hall 600. The history of this Palace of Justice dates back to 110 years ago. On the 11th of September 1916, in the middle of this First World War, the building here, this court building, was inaugurated by the Bavarian king. And to my mind, it's like a miracle that this building was finished during this war. At the inauguration, the king said that he did not have any doubt that in this building justice would be administered without making any difference between the people. On this picture, you see the king leaving the court building after the ceremony. In 1933, however, after the National Socialists had taken power, in Nuremberg at this building and as in all other courts in Germany, a so-called special court was set up. These courts were responsible for ideological crimes, for example, for crimes such as sexual relationships between Jews and non-Jews. There was a demonstrative trial against the Jewish merchant Leo Katzenberger, who in 1942 was sentenced to death because of alleged sexual relationships with a Jew. He was sentenced to death without the necessary evidence, and only a few years later, the presiding judge of this special court, Oswald Rothaug, was sentenced in one of the follow-up processes to the Nuremberg trials, and he was sentenced to lifelong imprisonment because of crimes against humanity. So on the left-hand side, you see the victim, Leo Katzenberger. On the right-hand side, the presiding judge of the special court, Oswald Rothaug. This Rothaug was sentenced in the same room where he pronounced his sentences, his unlawful sentences. However, Rothaug was set free in the late 1950s, so he also drew his pension. The National Socialist terror regime committed crimes against humanity all over Europe on a scale that was unprecedented and inconceivable. Fortunately, the four Allied powers agreed not to take revenge, but to respond by staging a trial against the main war criminals. And this trial took place in 1945 and 1946 in this building and in this very room here. So why did they pick Nuremberg? First, the prison was close to this facility here. In the background, you can see the prison, and in the right wing, this is where the war criminals were accommodated. The courtroom seemed to be big enough for the many delegations, and it had hardly suffered any damage in the war. And it was important to the Americans that Nuremberg was located in the zone that was US occupied. And of course, there was also a symbolic value to having this trial here in Nuremberg, because Nuremberg was the location of the big and symbolic party rallies of the Nazis. So this is the wing where the war criminals were imprisoned, but this building does no longer exist. It has been replaced by a new modern prison building. The Hall 600 was redesigned. Strong lights were installed so that the trial could be filmed. The room was extended to make more room for press representatives and the audience. And ultimately, the position of the parties was changed vis-à-vis to the defendants. And the tables or desks of the defending lawyers, defending counsels, there was the bench of the judges, 8 judges. In the forefront, there were the desks of the Russian, French, British, and US prosecutors. And in the back, on the left-hand side, there was the booth for the interpreters. It is important to note that the Nuremberg trial was the first event worldwide which was translated simultaneously into several languages. So this is the place where simultaneous interpretation was virtually invented. The Nuremberg trial is often called the birthplace and the birth hour of international law, and there are 2 reasons for this. First, the London Charter formulated crimes that came under the jurisdiction of the International Court. Crimes against humanity was included in here. Basically, these are the same crimes that are still embodied in international criminal law. Later on, genocide was added to the list. Second, the International Military Court decided on the responsibility of individuals. On the defendant's bench, there was not the German government or the German state as such. Instead, there were 21 individuals who were the leading representatives of the German Reich. And the court had to establish the individual guilt of each of them. At the end, 12 death penalties, 7 prison sentences were imposed, and 3 persons were acquitted. After this trial, there were 12 follow-up trials against high-ranking representatives of different professions, including physicians, lawyers, and industrial leaders. And these trials took place in the eastern wing of this building, and some of them even here in this room. And also the trial against the lawyers in which Ostwald Rothaug was sentenced was one of those trials. During these trials, the entire palace was seized by the US Army, while the local courts were shifted elsewhere. Nuremberg was destroyed to 90%, and this is why the regional court had to move elsewhere. And After an odyssey through different locations, the Nuremberg court here met for the first time again on the 13th of June in 1960. Gradually, the Nuremberg judiciary returned to this building here, and it was fully handed over to Theodor Haupt, the then president of the regional court. Took place on the 22nd of December 1969, 25 years after the local courts had to leave these buildings. Here you see Mr. Haupt on the right-hand side with a glass of beer in his hands. With the return of the court, reconstruction work was necessary. Courtroom 600 was redesigned to meet the then requirements of the local court, and it was changed back to the same design that it had before it was seized by the Americans. And this is the reason why it looks different from what it used to look like during the Nuremberg trials. The furniture which was introduced by the Americans was disposed of and destroyed. Only 2 defendants' benches have survived, and one of them is in the upper floor in the Memorium Museum. Theodor Haupt had this 2 meters high cross installed above the judge's bench. In the following years or subsequent years, the history of this courtroom was almost forgotten. There were many people who considered the war criminal trials to be a disgrace for Germany, and they wanted to forget about them. Only 20 years ago, the global relevance of this courtroom was rediscovered because people from all over the world came here because they wanted to see this courtroom where world history was written. The ongoing importance of international criminal law is reflected was reflected in the aftermath of the Balkan Wars and the wars in Africa. Therefore, the Memorium Nürnberger Prozesse Museum was opened in 2010. This is the most frequently visited museum of the city of Nuremberg. And by the way, it was opened with the Russian Foreign Secretary Lavrov attending the inauguration, and we had his speech translated only recently, but for time constraints, I cannot dwell on that. In 2014, the International Nuremberg Principles Academy was established, and it's supported by the federal government, the state of Bavaria, and the city of Nuremberg. Until February 2020, this room here was used by the regional court. Many spectacular proceedings took place here. The last decision that was pronounced here was pronounced on the 20th of February 2020, and ever since this room has been part of the Memorium Museum. To me personally, this courtroom here is more than an ordinary courtroom. I always considered it to be a place of remembrance and of encounter. Many events have been held here involving all kinds of people. High-ranking people from across the world have come here to visit this room, and it served as a setting for films. And history is always present here in this room, which exudes a very special atmosphere, an aura that you can hardly ignore. It is a place of remembrance and encounter, and as such it will continue to be visited by visitors from all over the world. I wish you a pleasant and fruitful stay here in this very special location where world history was written in 1945 and 46. Thank you very much for your attention.
Ladies and gentlemen, guests, colleagues, I am honored to welcome you to this conference on living humanity here in Nuremberg. Nuremberg is a city that carries great historical responsibility for the ambition towards responsibility and accountability. My name is Natalia Brehonicka. I am co-founder and chair of the Alliance Open Platform and deputy president of the Alliance of Ukrainian Organizations. 23 Ukrainian diaspora situations across Germany are assembled under the umbrella of this alliance. We support human rights. We strive to take responsibility, and we want the perpetrators to be held accountable. We support efforts towards understanding and the crimes that were committed and holding the perpetrators to account, the perpetrators of the war crimes. And we also support a free, sovereign, peace-loving Ukraine. We want it to become more visible and to be better understood. Ukraine is a country that is now in its 11th year of its war with Russia and which is opposing the Russian invasion. It is a resistance in the name of freedom for all of Europe. I would also like to use this opportunity to thank the project team of Eastern, Central and Southeastern Europe at the Federal Agency for Civic Education. I'd like to thank them for the invitation to co-host and co-organize this event. We are proud to be a part of this conference. And let me also emphasize that incredible work is being done at the Federal Agency, and we, as a small NGO, we are really delighted and honored to be part of this conference today and tomorrow. Let me also thank Dr. Dickert and Mr. Husemann from the Higher Regional Court of Nuremberg. Thank you. Living humanity means defining key principles and defending principles of humanity, especially in times of war and violence. It is a war that is happening right at the center of Europe, and also we see wars happening in many other parts of the world, times where democratic principles are being challenged, where established framework of responsibility and accountability seem no longer to work properly, at a time when the right of the stronger prevails over the power of the law, or at least it seems so. Living humanity not only defines a moral category and a moral attitude, it also implies a duty to document crimes, to hold perpetrators accountable, and to protect people, support people who experienced violence and support the affected societies. But it's also about combining historical lessons with current events, and it implies demanding responsibility and accountability. Historical lessons and historical crimes that led to thousands of victims must be dealt with. high-ranking speakers were or could be invited to this conference. They work on documentation, on dealing with the crimes of the past, and they put their lives into the service of this subject. I thank them. I thank those who are able to be here today. I want to thank them for their hard work and dedication for justice and human rights. I wish us all a very interesting discussion and welcome to this conference on living humanity. Thank you. I now pass the floor to Mr. Niels Beindke, who is editor and author in the culture sector of the Bavarian public broadcaster. Thank you. Have a good evening. I will keep this brief because there will be two keynotes in a minute. Patrick Desbois is going to talk to us. He is a priest. He is the chair of the association Yahad in Unum, an organization which researches and documents the killings of Jews in Ukraine and Belarus and other Eastern European countries during the Second World War. With the words of Patrick Desbois, this is a Holocaust of the bullets. This is a term that he coined, referring to the mass shootings at the hands of the Nazis. Since the illegal aggression of Russia against Ukraine, the entire country of Ukraine is also a place where these crimes
Thank you for this invitation. First, I would like to say it's very moving to speak in Nuremberg in this special room because we work since 20 years, as you said, not only in Ukraine. We work in Russia, in Belarus, in Moldavia, Romania, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland. We have interviewed 9,000 witnesses, not Jews, present at the killing of the Jews or killing of the Roma. We have found a mass grave of 2 million Jews, many mass graves totally unknown. And we went on to do the same job in Guatemala. The State Department of America asked me to investigate about the shooting and the killing in Guatemala during the Conflicto Armado. And since 10 years, we work in Iraq about the slavery of the Yazidi by ISIS. And when I saw what happened in Ukraine, I know Ukraine because my grandpa has been deported in Rabaruska and Lemberg, but I know Ukraine because we have been in all the villages. It's the only country where I know all the villages. And I will try to share with you some points of reflection because I also forgot to say I also investigate in actual Ukraine. We focalize on the victim of tortures by FSB in the jails. So everything is sensitive. My organization is a ground organization. We never made politics, because if you made politics in a country like Russia or Belarus, you don't stay a long time. So why we could investigate about the shootings by the Einsatzgruppen or by anybody against the Jews? Because some shootings are very well known, like Babi Yar. But if you are in Lemberg, it's totally unknown. It's a forest with 49 mass graves. And if you go north of Odessa, the biggest mass grave is 54,000 people shot in one place. We could investigate. I never came in Germany to investigate because I know Germany is like France. I cannot knock at the door and say where you were. But in Ukraine, first, very quickly, I saw people accepted to speak. So who is speaking to us? You know, for every shooting, the German arrived in time at 6 a.m. in the village, made an announce, we deport you to Palestine, or we deport you to Kiev, and at 5 p.m. they left. But they needed a lot of people. The Germans came only with their trucks, cartridges, guns, machine gun, and alcohol. So they needed simple people to dig the mass grave. So 3-4 days before the shooting, an architect from Germany arrives and says, I want a mass grave this size, because he knows how many Jews they want to kill. They need people to fulfill the mass grave, because many people are buried alive. In every village, they told us the mass grave was moving during 3 days, because they push the disabled people, the older people, the babies, because it was a request, one bullet, one Jew, one bullet, no more. There is also somebody who cook, because they make always a break at noon, and so in the morning they request a lady who is cooking just near the mass grave to make like a buffet. And after we find 22 jobs given to local people. And so these people accepted to speak. That was a big miracle. 99% of the witnesses we met have been accepted. It has been taken by professional cameraman, photograph, giving their name and giving acceptance of that in every country, from Russia, from Azerbaijan to Lithuania. I realized that in a mass crime you have a gray zone. A gray zone is done by simple people who are not bad, not good, but suddenly are employed to do the job. And this is the first question I would like to raise, because I work in Eastern Europe. So when I began, I was always in Ukraine. People told me, oh, bad Ukrainian, very anti-Semite. After I work in Poland, they told me, oh, awful Polish. After I work in Lithuania, the same. Strangely, when I was in Russia, nobody told me awful Russian. But suddenly, I work in Iraq. Very few Polish, very few Lithuanian, very few Russian, and the same music. ISIS arrive in time, in morning, say to the people, don't worry, it's only changement of identity, don't worry. And in evening, people are either killed or they sold the girls to be sex slaves or put the young boys to be trained as terrorists. You must know that a woman who is going out of ISIS today, Yazidi, she has been sold between 25 times to 35 times. 11 years of slavery. So I discovered that a genocide is not a national disease. You know, people imagine, the genocide came from Germany, so, okay, I would dream we could make a wall around Germany and it finished. But in Iraq, very few German. In Guatemala, very few German. It's a human disease. So the question is, why people are doing mass crimes? Why people suddenly are following? Why people are shooting, raping, stealing? Because it's never pure. It's not only killing, it's always raping and always stealing. As I say always because I'm professor in Georgetown University in Washington with my colleague Andrzej Mansky, and I say always to the American, you know, the SS, it was not a non-profit. When they killed the family, they took everything. The house was empty. So the first thing I would like to raise, and it's a complicated question today, it's the weight of propaganda. You know, people said we can kill the Jews, legal. We can kill the Roma, legal. We can kill the communists, legal. We can kill the disabled people, legal. We can kill the Mischlinger, legal. But illegal to take something. It was written, forbidden. So the families, until now, it's easy to them to say, we kill Jews, yes, but it's impossible to say, I stole something, because it was illegal. So when I was in Iraq, it was legal to steal. It was legal to buy girls as sex slaves and to sell them endlessly. It was legal to take the babies. It was legal to kill the grandma, etc. And people, actually we have a judgment in France with Nemouche, who came from there. He said, no, I was a simple guard, I did nothing. So you must understand, a mass killer is not a serial killer. He kills, he rapes, he steals, but after he comes back to normal life. You know, after 45, in Germany, you didn't have mass shootings everywhere. People came back. That's it. So, problem of propaganda. You know, when I began working in Ukraine of today, and I knew that the Russian didn't stop saying that all the Ukrainians are Nazi. Me, I have been in Russia everywhere. I know the priest, I know the mass grave. I have been in Ukraine, same religion, mostly Orthodox. I was thinking nobody will follow Putin. People will know you are not Nazi. No, they believe it. I will never forget, I interviewed a girl. She was arrested, an Ukrainian girl, and she had a small tattoo here. And they wanted, she said, it's a Nazi tattoo. And she was naked, and it was awful. How you can make a full population like Russia believe the neighbors are Nazi today, and the president is half Jew, and there are Jews in the government. That's propaganda. Propaganda changes the eyes. You see somebody like an enemy. And nothing resists. I began my interview in Poland. It was a priest, an old priest, a nice guy, not a fascist. He was old, but he was just living in front of the camp of Belzec. 500,000 Jews gassed. It was my first interview, so I was not good. And I told him, Father, it was not embarrassing to see these Jews die in front of your church every day? Because 500,000 in a village like Belzec, it's a village. You know what he told me? Yes, it was difficult for me. Because my mother didn't bear the smoke. She was headache. So I lost all my afternoon to take care of my mom. I will never forget this interview. He was a nice priest. He was not a fascist. He was not a Nazi. He was a human being. But the propaganda changed his eyes. He suddenly saw the Jews like a small animal. That's the problem today. How the people from Putin was shooting, how they see the Ukrainian. Of course, if they believe they are Nazi, they are bringing freedom to the planet. It's the first thing. The second thing I would like to share with you is that when you have a mass crimes, like Babi Yar, or anywhere, or in Mosul, the neighbors go to watch. When they are sure it's not for them. I will never forget, I was in Medjugorje. Medjugorje is a city from Ukraine. And I found 17 witnesses present at the shooting. And I will never forget a lady, she told me, Father, we didn't find a good place for the first shooting. We didn't see everything. But for the second shooting, we found a good place. We were and I say, but how did you know? She said, I was a child and my mother came back from the market and said, we have to dress very well because they kill the Jews. So the mother went with the two children, watched the killing of the Jews, and I asked, did you stay the whole time? She said, yes, I cried a lot. I said, why did you stay? And she told me, you know, it was interesting for us, the children. And now I perhaps heard thousands of times that it was interesting for us, the children, to see a shooting. So you must understand, we make, because now we are a nice country, we are in freedom, we are in Germany, it's nice, there is a democracy, you have elections, etc. So I know. But in a time when you make mass crimes, if you were sure you were not Jew, you were not Roma, you were not communist, you were not partisan, you went to watch. You went to watch. And so I never found a secret shooting. It's public. It's public, and people even run to have a good place. Even of Babi Yar, people were climbing on the roof of the houses to show the shooting. I met a Polish man, he was climbing on a bridge to see the selection. And his only problem was to be safe. That's humanity. When I teach that in America, people say, oh, awful Europe. I say, do you remember 9/11? Do you remember the planes? How many times you see the planes entering, and there were only 2 planes. We saw that perhaps 200 times. Did you close the TV? No, because you watch. So that's also a thing that helps us to investigate. For every crime, there is a witness. There is no crime without a witness. It's not true. All the shootings are public. All the beheadings in Iraq are public. All the killing in Guatemala are public. All the attacks today from Russia are public. I will raise another point. You know, I have a grand organization, me. We are 20 in Paris. We have 1 team in Brussels, work for Iraq. We have 1 team in Guatemala. We have André, who is in Köln. We have people in New York. But everybody is on the ground. To be working with me, it means to accept to go in a farm and interrogate poor people with respect. So it means both to be academic, to read the archives, both to be on the ground, and not to make politics. That's the most complicated. I have a question. We work to reveal the name of the killers. I will give you an example that you will understand very well. In Babi Yar, more than 30,000 people killed in a few days. We found in archives 2,000 Germans involved. Do you know how many have been judged? Babi Yar is very well known. 5. So it means 1,995 came back somewhere or died in the front or came back in Germany, and that's it. We judge Big Boss. To judge the guy who killed your mom, it's much more complicated. You know, I work with the Jewish people, I speak Hebrew. It's much easier to say my grandma died in Holocaust, in Shoah, but to say my grandmother has been killed by Jürgen Hans from Stuttgart. Very different. Very different. I give always as an example the same thing, the 9/11 and the plane. I ask my students, do you know at least the name of one guy who hijacked a plane? No. We know the brand of the plane, American Airlines. We know the towers and the number of victims. Who were the guys? So that's dangerous. It's why in Ukraine, I had many discussions with the Ministry of Justice in the beginning. I say, I understand you want to judge Putin. I understand. I told them you lose energy. He's a billionaire, and today, you know, Rubio is with Lavrov. we are not part of the game, you realize? You realize yesterday was a big meeting with Macron, but Lavrov didn't come. And Rubio also, because they make their music by themselves. And Putin will meet with President of America, and we will not be in the music. So I think we must absolutely help the victim to be in capacity to judge their criminal, their personal criminal. I will give you an example. In Iraq, every girl who has been raped by many men, she has the list of the rapists. And she's interviewed during hours describing everyone and asking for justice. This one was Saudi, this one was French, this one was German, this one, etc. And with that, we can cooperate. We cooperated with your justice in Germany, with federal justice, because when they come back here, the terrorists, they say also they did nothing. But we have the victims. It's the only group I know who is ready to speak for justice, individual justice. We have found now 1,400 names of Islamists with details, physical details. So I stay a grand, simple organization, and I say, don't dream. You know, when I was in Ukraine and they began to speak to Judge Putin, they told me, like in Nuremberg. I say, okay, but in Nuremberg, who will catch Putin in Moscow? Big question. And now Putin will fly to meet Trump, etc. I cannot say a lot of problem for that because I don't want to lose my visa. So I would say we have to help the victim to find who did that. Andrei, who is a lawyer, we have a lady from Ukraine. She came especially to Germany. She has been raped, but she recognized the rapist at the TV. You are the only country to do it well because you exercise universal competence. You are the only country who accepts to judge a Russian who raped an Ukrainian lady who is not German. I say that because I don't know where you took that, but I can tell you I travel a lot. Always I advertise Germany and the system of justice. You have a capacity of gestion of universal competence that we don't have in other countries. I will not tell you the countries where I went, and people know, no, they are not from my country. I will finish saying also that don't be afraid of the big news. We will have big news. Don't think that Putin will meet Trump only to have breakfast. Decision will be done. And I can tell you from Washington, the decisions of Trump are quick. So we can be surprised. We can lose hope. We say, what are you doing? We are a non-profit working for justice, and the game now is in Doha. And we are not, nobody invited us in Doha. Don't listen too much to the big news, because you can lose hope. Me, sometimes I close the TV, because the TV will show you only the big fish. Of course, you know, some people dream of a new Yalta, without many countries. In Europe, some people are afraid, will Europe be in the game, or only a spectator of the game? We don't know. But you have to work for the victims, for them, because they will have to have justice, even if it's not next year, it will be in 10 years. You know, I will finish by that, you know, I am a believer, in spite I am a priest. And you know, in the beginning of the Bible, Cain is killing Abel, his brother. And God asks his question, where is your brother? That's the question of God. Where is your brother? So I know you will be voting very quickly in Germany, but all of us, we will die. God will not ask us, where was your president? He will ask us, where were you? You. So don't be watching too large, work at the size of who we are, and try to change the music for the justice, for the simple victims who have no hope to see a judge. I'm not sure we will have the luck to see a new Nuremberg, but you are Germany with such a capacity to do. Thank you so much.
We need to help the victims. That's what Patrick Debois says, chairperson of the Yad in Unum organization and professor of the practice of the forensic study of the Holocaust. And he shared some of his experiences from his work in Ukraine, Iraq, and Guatemala with us. This brings us to another keynote speech, which will take us to the courts where crimes against humanity are being dealt with. Angelika Nussberger is our guest. She's professor of constitutional law, international law, and comparative law at the University of Cologne. From 2011 to 2019, she was judge at the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, where she dealt with cases that involved crimes against humanity. And now she's going to tell us a bit about this work and give us her perspective of this international jurisdiction. Warm welcome to you, Angelika Nussberger. Ladies and gentlemen, the title of my presentation is "What's the Purpose of It All? Human rights violations in war taken to court." In April 23, the European Court of Human Rights had to decide on a damage claim by Georgia resulting from the so-called five-day wars in 2008. And the court found that Russia should pay a sum of 130 million euros in terms of damages. The decision was taken unanimously. But since then, nothing has happened. Not a single euro was transferred or paid. A short look at the timeline shows why this decision of the court was taken unanimously and why it remained without consequences. The 28th of April, the date 2023, the date when the court passed its decision, came just 1 year after the 24th of February 2022, when the war of aggression was started by Russia. At this point in time, in April 2023, there was no single Russian judge in the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights, so that there was nobody to contradict. The Russian judge, Mikhail Lobov, had left the court on the 16th of September 2022, and he had not been replaced. On the 16th of September 2022, Russia ceased to be a contracting party of the European Human Rights Convention. For this reason, all letters addressed by the court to the Russian authorities remained without answer. They wrote several letters, letters asking for the Russian comments concerning the damage claims, letters asking the Russian government to appoint an ad hoc lawyer, a letter asking the Russian side to consent to the appointment of a judge from amongst the judges of the court. So, at the Court of Human Rights, judges remained under like-minded people. This taking a decision had become more simpler, and this was had been different in the previous decision of 2021, which had been taken against the vote of the Russian judge at the time. The Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe, which is responsible for implementing the court's decisions, has recently addressed another letter to Russia in September 2024, pointing out that time is moving on and that interest payments become due. And let me quote from this letter: "We wish to remind you that the deadline for the payment of the reasonable damages set by the court has expired on the 28th of July 2023, and that so far no information has been submitted. The committee wishes to re-emphasize that there is an unconditional obligation on the part of Russia to pay the reasonable damages set by the court, and asks the Russian authorities urgently to pay the damages together with the interest payments that have accrued." On the 17th of September 2024, the amount owed by the Russian Federation amounts to 141,183,849 euro and 33 euro cents. This means that the court, just as the Council of Europe as a whole, continues to be actively involved in cases against Russia, that it decides about wars, about the Georgian-Russian war, the Russian-Ukrainian war, but the court remains in its comfort zone without having to take into serious account the counterposition, the position of Russia. There is a decision by the court, and nevertheless the question is justified to ask to what avail. You can raise the same question when it comes to the establishment of a register for damages for Ukraine. The purpose of that register is to record damage claims, but here again the partners are just among like-minded people. The register is run by the Council of Europe on the basis of a so-called partial and enlarged agreement. But under international law, it's not possible to conclude agreements at the expense of third parties. Therefore, this register is just about compiling claims. Whether these claims can actually be imposed and enforced does not depend on the will of the member states of the Council of Europe. Instead, it depends on geopolitical developments. And here the prospects are bleak, not just since last weekend and the Munich Security Conference. We cannot look ahead into the future, but we can look back into the past. And therefore, I should like to use the short time allotted to me to discuss the question as to whether we are hopeless romantics when we believe that in the aftermath of war and in the aftermath of crimes against humanity, there can be and should be some form of fair compensation. We are here assembled in Nuremberg in courtroom 600, which stands for a fair compensation, or to put it more cautiously, a hopeful step in the right direction. But what was the situation like in the aftermath of wars that came after 1945? Was this model emulated? The situation was most promising after the end of the Cold War in the 1990s, when there was a general consensus and commitment to standards that were based on democracy and the rule of law. Even at that time, there were wars in Yugoslavia, in Chechnya, in Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and, as I said before, in Ukraine. And there were also courts, even a big number of courts: the Tribunal on Yugoslavia, the International Court of Justice in The Hague, the European Court of Human Rights, in order to mention just the most important players. The International Court of Justice had just been established and did not yet play a decisive role. In addition, there were constitutional courts that were also involved, and the Russian Constitutional Court, by the way, played an interesting role, particularly. Let us shed some light on these proceedings. I can already anticipate the outcome of our assessment. There is light and shadow, and it will be up to you to make your own assessment. If you are an optimist, you will say that there is light. If you are a pessimist, you will say that there is a lot of shadow. Let me turn to the war in Chechnya first. Let me start off with the war which raged in the slipstream of other political events in a part of Europe that some people do not even consider to be part of Europe, namely the Chechnya War, or to be more specific, the two Chechen wars. The first Chechen War took place from 1994 to 1996 and ended with the withdrawal of the Russian troops. And the second war in Chechnya lasted from 1999 to 2009 and resulted in Kadyrov becoming a vassal of Russia. It may sound surprising, but there is hardly any other war in history which has been so highly juridified as this one. It started already by the fact that the decree with which Yeltsin ordered the war to start was submitted to members of the Duma, and it was submitted to the Russian Constitutional Court and was found to be constitutional in a very controversial decision which contained 6 special votes. This judgment still is a milestone in Russian and international legal history. Even though this decree was found to be in line with the Russian constitution, it is quite unique that a constitutional court in this case scrutinized the legal basis for the exercise of armed power. The decisions taken by the current Russian Constitutional Court, which still contains some of the same judges as then. The decisions taken by that court concerning the annexation of Zaporizhzhia, Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, and Kherson speak a completely different language. As one observer once said, these decisions remind us not of court decisions, but of Orwellian fantasies. The European Court of Human Rights also passed decisions on the Chechnya War. The groundbreaking first decision came in 2005, namely the decision on Isayeva, Yusupovna, Bazayeva versus Russia. The Chechen civil population had fled to Grozny because an escape corridor had been announced. But then, after hours of waiting, they had been forced to return. In the ensuing chaos, the Russian Air Force bombarded the fleeing people. The European Court of Human Rights dealt with this situation and all its details. It heard the victims and the Russian government and found that Russia had violated, among other things, the right to life. Compensation payments ranging from 5,000 to 25,000 euros were set, which is not a lot compared to the sums that are paid normally in the United States, for example. But after all, it was a recognition of the intangible damage that had been done, and Russia did pay. In this case, and in more than 120 other cases related to the Chechnya War, where Russia had been sentenced because of violations against the ban on torture, the right of life, Russia paid. Russia always pays. That was a standing adage amongst us judges in Strasbourg. Russia had been taken to court, and this was a success for human rights. However, it must be admitted that Russia did pay, yes, but Russia did not live up to the other obligations that had been imposed on Russia. They did not disclose information on the whereabouts of the people who had disappeared, for example. Now I should like to say a few words about the war in Georgia. Attempts of Georgia to take Russia to court in the International Court in The Hague failed. There was no special tribunal. Tens of thousands of individual complaints and an interstate application were taken to and submitted to the European Court of Human Rights. And in the case of the interstate application, the court had to decide whether the court had jurisdiction also in the hot phase of a war. And the outcome was that the court decided in a vote of 11 against 8 that the convention is applicable only if a state has effective control of its territory, which was not the case in a situation of warfare, because this situation is characterized by chaos. So the court declared itself not to be responsible for the hot phase of the war. The damage claims that I referred to concerned only marginal aspects of the fight, of the conflict, while the victims of the warfare as such were left outside. If the court were to uphold this jurisdiction, it would mean that no complaints by victims in the Russian-Ukraine conflict can be submitted to the European Court of Human Rights, because this war is a hot conflict. Whether the court will uphold this principle is something that remains to be seen. We are waiting eagerly for the decision in the case of the crash of Malaysian Airlines flight MH17, which has been combined with other hostilities in the eastern part of Ukraine and is the subject of a very big and extensive case. Now I should like to turn to the war in Bosnia. The Bosnia War officially lasted from 1992 to 1995, when the Dayton Agreement was concluded. There is no doubt that innumerable crimes have been committed in that period. We all recall the reports of concentration camps, rapings, killings, and one word stands for the bad conscience of Europe, namely Srebrenica. For the victims of the Bosnian War, access to compensation was largely blocked. At least many of the perpetrators were sentenced by the Tribunal on Yugoslavia, which was set up on the basis of a Security Council regulation. The official title of the tribunal was International Tribunal for the Prosecution of Persons Responsible for Serious Violations of International Humanitarian Law committed in the territory of the former Yugoslavia since 1991. Amongst those sentenced by the tribunal were Ratko Mladic and Radovan Karadzic. As we all know, Milosevic died during the trial before a sentence could be passed. In total, 161 individuals were indicted, 84 of them were sentenced. And the tribunal just dealt with the criminal law aspects and not with the compensation for human rights violation. The victims could not turn to the European Court of Human Rights because Bosnia and Herzegovina was a state which was established only after the end of the war in 1995, and at the time it was not member of the Council of Europe, so that the European Human Rights Convention was not applicable. It entered into force only in 2005. The attempt of the Association of the Mothers of the Victims of Srebrenica to seek justice in Strasbourg failed. Their complaint was rejected as being inadmissible. Only in 2019, that is 24 years after the events, did the applicants get a partial success in the Dutch Hoge Raad, which recognized that the Dutch government was co-responsible for the forced evacuation of 350 of the 9,000 killed Bosnian men. The decisive trial for genocide took place in the International Court in The Hague, and it took also a long time. Bosnia-Herzegovina filed the complaint in 1993 while the war was still ongoing. In 2007, that is 14 years later, the court took its decision. And as is normal with court decisions, someone wins the case, the other side loses. In this case, however, the International Court of Justice managed to frustrate both sides and deprive them of their faith in justice. Due to the limited jurisdiction of the ICJ, it could only decide about genocide, but could not take any decision concerning war crimes or crimes against humanity. Genocide, however, is a very specific crime, and it requires, in particular, that there is an intent to annihilate and eliminate a specific ethnic group. And the ICJ found that this is something that Serbia could not be reproached of in the Bosnian War in general, nor in Srebrenica in particular. Serbia was sentenced for genocide only to the extent that it had not met its obligation to prevent the genocide of the Bosnian Serbs. So the court found that there was just an indirect guilt, and it did not set any compensation. What does this mean? The massacre of Srebrenica was taken to court. The court took long to come up with a decision, but this decision bring about reconciliation in this war-torn society. A waiting Bosnian intellectual who waited for the court's decision in the court building tore the text apart once it was announced, thus giving vent to his own frustration. In May 2024, the UN General Assembly voted with 84 against 19 votes, with 68 abstentions, to establish and introduce an International Day of Remembrance of the genocide in Srebrenica in 1995. In the Republika Srpska, people responded with an aggressive rhetoric, and they reintroduced the study of the heroic deeds of the war criminals as a mandatory subject in history lessons. The Constitutional Court of Bosnia-Herzegovina declared this to be anti-constitutional, but as far as I know, the Republika Srpska has not lived up to this court decision. I think it's no exaggeration to say that despite or because of these court decisions on the war, this country has not come closer to peace even 30 years after the end of the war. What does this imply for our hope to be able to contain wars in the present time on the basis of reason and in order to do justice to those who have suffered and to punish those who have violated the law? We must not give up on and we must not stop our attempts to achieve justice, in particular with regard to the war in Ukraine. But we need to remain realistic as to what the law can achieve in a new world that is characterized by realpolitik and by power policy. History has not done us the favor of coming to an end, as it was suggested by Francis Fukuyama in his famous book, End of History. Nor does it look as if history were going to do us this favor anytime soon. Quite to the contrary. History is accelerating right now. So it's not just that Kant's eternal peace has become a remote thing. Instead, the hope for justice as exposed is also a remote hope. But this does not mean that we should give up. We will continue our efforts. Thank you. Thoughts by Angelika Nussberger concerning war crimes in the courtroom, and I should now like to welcome the members of our panel, Mrs. Nussberger, Mr. Debois, Mr. Kalek, Mr. Müllers, and I think it's very moving for all of us to be seated up here on this judge's bench. Too late again, war crimes and the struggle for justice. This is the title of our panel discussion. You have heard to two of the panel members already, Angelika Nussberger and Patrick Desbois, and they will be joined by two other panel members. On the right-hand side, next to Angelika Nussberger, there is Wolfgang Kalek. He's a lawyer and co-founder of the human rights organization European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights, ECCHR in Berlin. That's an association which documents human rights violations and crimes against humanity, for example, in Syria, Ukraine, but also in Gaza, and attempts to bring those crimes to court. The association is also active in the field of human rights, arms shipments, and working conditions in countries in the region. And Christoph Möllers is our next guest. He sits next to Mrs. Nussberger. He's a professor for public law, in particular constitutional law and legal philosophy at Humboldt University Berlin, and a permanent fellow at Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin. He is the author of Freiheitsgrade, a much acclaimed book in which he tries to defend the liberal tradition against attacks from anti-constitutional organizations. So he is concerned about the ways in which we can use our political liberties. So a warm welcome to all of you.
We're here, and I'm only going to say this, and then I will join you up there. We're here on the invitation of the Federal Agency for Civic Education. We meet here at a very historic site, at a very historic location that wrote history in the legal area in this fight against crimes against humanity, and we would like to cast our look back into this particular period. We would like to look at the institutions, the possibilities of how to deal legally with these crimes, how to bring them to court, how to adjudicate on them. And Angelika Nussberger reminded all of us of the historic caesura as regards the international order and also the history of democracies. But maybe we ought to also look back to the introduction by Patrick Desbois and Angelika Nussberger, Christoph Kalek, and Mr. Möllers. Maybe you want to pick up on where they left off. Wolfgang Kalek has the floor. Well, thank you very much. And also thank the Federal Agency for Civic Education to invite us here to Nuremberg. There are two things that I remember with regard to Nuremberg. Well, first, it was the birthplace of international humanitarian law, and also among the many, decrees that we are currently contending with by Trump is also one that is leveled against the International Criminal Court. That obviously is an institution that is far from perfect, but that is trying to bring some redress to those who have suffered from crimes against humanity. So Karin Khan is the first on the list whom this decree has aimed at. Now, we also have to remind ourselves of the great jurists, Telford Taylor, Benjamin Ferencz, whose bust you see over there. And there were three of these eminent jurists and lawyers who, right from the start, and that was characteristic of them, that they did not want to adjudicate in the sense of a victor's justice. They never saw this. But Jackson himself, who was really a visionary, said, this court can only make sense if what we are adjudicating here will later on be used by all those who have similar cases to rule on. So, and that also meant, obviously, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States, and cases that would be brought before them. But none of those crimes against humanity that these four Allied powers committed later on were actually brought to trial. For example, while this court was sitting, the crimes of the colonial powers of Great Britain and France, suppressing, for example, colonial resistance movements. And Telford Taylor, in his book, pointed this out from Nuremberg to Vietnam. Also, the Vietnam War was never actually adjudicated in court. And Mr. Ferencz later on spoke of that, the period immediately preceding the genocide of the Yazidi, namely the war that destabilized Iraq, and that was action, obviously a military action waged by the United States, was also never dealt with in a court of law. So we have to look at the different cases where we could perhaps create at least a certain measure of justice, and I agree with you. We deplore this, but on the other hand, we have as many possibilities as we've never had before. And there is one thing that brought me back also to Nuremberg 25 years before. Today, there was an attempt to come to grips with the crimes of the Argentinian junta. And at the time, for example, the public prosecutor's office in Nuremberg was very active. 3 arrest warrants were actually issued against Madeira and Cera. And that is a great difference compared to Nuremberg. The Holocaust was actually only something that happened on the margins. The actual victims of the Holocaust were not subject to the action that took place in the court. Patrick Dubas said the victims, we have to help the victims. On the other hand, I would say we can help the victims to help themselves. We can work together with them. For example, the Argentinian civic rights movement is an excellent example, an excellent case in point for the victims actually helping themselves, fighting for their rights. So it's an immensely important wave of the sort of trying to obtain legal redress by lawyers and jurists, but not leaving everything to the experts or the legal experts, but also leave something to society. The same happens now with Ukraine. Coming to grips with Russian war crimes against Ukraine is not starting with 2022, but 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. So legal specialists, jurists, and lawyers started to do that, but it wasn't really seen all that much because nobody had such a great interest. Chechnya, for example, that too wasn't met with particularly great interest by prosecutors in Europe, and legal action brought by plaintiffs didn't actually bring about any kind of court action. It's difficult when courts only ever come into play when it is about your own interests. Then it's easy for the United States to act against the International Court. In the case of Ukraine, this is a case in point. An important aim of the Ukrainian opposition is, for example, a special tribunal. Because of this war of aggression, there should be some kind of statute in the international law that all crimes should be equally prosecuted. That was an intention, but Britain and France were against that, not to speak of other big powers. And then after 2022, the United Kingdom and the United States started to set up a tribunal, and they were actually met with great resistance by the states of the Global South, not because the Global South doesn't have an understanding of human rights or that certain crimes against humanity need to be addressed, but because they no longer were willing to actually accept that kind of procedure by the West. And the same, in a way, happens now in Gaza. Not only is the attack of Hamas against the Jewish people a crime, but all of the international experts in international law say that Israel, too, in the way that it proceeded against Hamas, violated international law. And the International Court, the International Criminal Court, and the International Court of Human Rights came to certain conclusions. And unfortunately, the Federal Republic of Germany did not follow. But the reputation and the legitimacy of these two courts were questioned by the German government, and that makes it easier, unfortunately, much easier for President Trump to issue decrees against the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. And I think it is to be feared that the whole of the construct of international humanitarian law can be undermined in this way. So the end of this particular story is still open. The jury is still out on that one. But international law is always, and international humanitarian law is always has always been a history of progress and then also setbacks. One of the worst. My friend Anwar al-Boudi, a Syrian lawyer specializing in humanitarian law, is here. And he said to me at the time when we were dealing with the first cases of Syria, no, Wolfgang, I don't want this to take so long as with Argentina. No, it didn't last so long. In 2022, there was indeed a court case here against the Syrian, and Patrick Dubois mentioned that we have this capacity. Actually, 2 years later, there was this coup and this upheaval in Syria, which toppled the government and the torture regime of Assad, and accusing them in a court of law and indicting them. That is something that is at the very top of the agenda. So there are setbacks, but there are also positive messages and positive signals. And this, Mr. Nussberger, is something where I agree with you. We need to take account of the shadow, but we also and the realities, as Ms. Stechowicz said, but we also need to work with the opportunities that are still out there. Thank you very much to Wolfgang Kalek and Christoph Möllers. My question is addressed to you now. Would you like to respond to what you've heard so far? Well, just briefly, of course, I thought generally also because of the motto, the heading of this whole conference, I wondered what Hannah Arendt would have said. Would she be here, and what would she say on international humanitarian? And she was a very ambivalent observer of the court proceedings from afar, and then later on she was present for the Eichmann trial. And of course there was a moral imperative which made it incumbent upon you to do something. But she was also very skeptical because on the one hand, and that's clear because she asked herself to what extent certain proceedings could actually live up to, well, doing justice for certain crimes, and also skeptical, I believe, because human rights was something that she considered to be necessary, but which is first and foremost not basically a moral phenomenon, has a moral aspect, but actually very much political in nature. And that's quite interesting if you look at the Nuremberg trial and interpret it in such a way that you say, well, the Nuremberg trials also were very small but important from a political point of view, a positive momentum, because the Allies were actually only in agreement on wishing to obtain victory over the Germans, to defeat them. But then, all of a sudden, something like almost akin to a cosmopolitan project started. So there was a moral minimum, basically, on which they could all agree. And I think, in spite of all of these setbacks that we've seen, this was a possibility that opened up perspectives which could have happened, and what cosmopolitanism means actually and can mean. But on the other hand, Arendt obviously remembered that something like human rights protection only exists when political entities are willing to actually address those issues, and that is no longer the world these days, because for quite some time we don't really see a proper consensus on protection of human rights. We only ever talk about results. We never talk about what was brought to a court of law, for example, in China, and then obviously human rights is always universal in the sense that we can only understand it in the sense that we can adjudicate when the law isn't met. Now, these political communities and these national communities these days are actually no longer willing to come to some kind of consensus. You can start with the Russian war of aggression, then you come to the United States. Wolfgang Kalek has already raised this issue, but the Federal Republic of Germany, that for a very long time had a very strong view on legality and rule of law, that also saw international law as part and parcel of its own legal construct, of its own legal architecture. The Federal Republic of Germany has more and more a tendency to become a somewhat uncertain entity. We're talking, for example, about certain arrest warrants of the ICC. So legality all of a sudden has become almost a political plaything, which is remarkable for Germany, because Germany doesn't have all that much of an identity, but this legality used to be, in a way, something that was very much German identity, part and parcel of our identity. And all of a sudden, there seems to be a vague area. It was interesting to hear from Mr. Dubois when he said, we live in certain islands of social and political communities who deal with human rights, individual states. Well, sometimes we are supported, or that these groups are supported by European states, but there is civic groups that are trying to be active in coming to grips with these human rights violations, document them, register them, and perhaps hand it over to another generation that is able to do more about this than the present generation. So far, we haven't seen a global or cosmopolitan approach. But we have to remind ourselves that this is a fight that we all need to fight, a battle for all of us, and we cannot simply leave it to legal institutions or the global community. Fight for human rights is almost always a fight of a political entity that is willing to address those issues. And actually, turning this into law is always a little bit ambivalent, and that's something that you can also learn from Hannah Arendt. We learn from the court proceedings, where you have a non-partisan approach, where facts are put to the table, where you try to come to the sort of basic facts of the matter, that is something that we can still practice, but we need to do something that can be a legacy for future generations. On the other hand, one also has to say that sometimes it's a fig leaf. Some of the cases that Ms. Nussberger presented to us today, Russia pays, she said, is not only ambivalent because human rights violations as themselves haven't stopped, but with the membership of Russia is over. But Russia, even while it was part of this convention, in a way still had legitimacy and maybe didn't deserve that. Regimes are always trying with these memberships to achieve a certain degree of legitimacy. And I think we can learn from Arendt and her more skeptical view on whether that is actually true. Thank you very much. Thanks to Christoph Möllers. So you mentioned a number of points, and I don't know whether we can actually deal with all of them in this brief period of time. I think Ms. Nussberger, Mr. Dubois, you will probably react to what Wolfgang Kalek said, and Angelika Nussberger. You, in your speech, in your address, mentioned something, this new era of geopolitics, this caesura that we now see. Power politics seem to hold sway. We are seeing this in the announcements of the Americans as regards peace negotiations on this war of aggression against Ukraine, and also the way that the American Vice President addressed the Munich Security Conference, what sort of consequences this will have. Well, we can only guess. Wolfgang Kalek wonders whether the international sort of architecture of international law and international human rights may be undermined. So how do you see this, Ms. Nussberger?
I would agree that we are afraid that this ground system may be undermined, and I should just highlight this, giving human rights as an example. Mr. Müller referred to the ambivalence of the court proceedings, but we can also say that the human rights are an ambivalent term. It is not so that Putin says that he's not interested in human rights. If you look at his declarations of war, which he announced immediately before the bombardment started, he reproaches the West of having the wrong human rights, and that the Russian culture would undermine if one were to subscribe to those wrong ideas of what human rights are. He says in the West, they have human rights that would undermine our culture. And when I listened to the speech by Vice President Vance on Friday, he said that we Europeans have a wrong concept of freedom of expression. And he brought quoted some examples of where courts struck a balance between freedom of expression and other rights. And he too says you have a different concept. And what I see is that everybody subscribes to human rights, because human rights is a concept that creates legitimacy. But everybody has subsumed something completely different under this concept. And in future, people will say, I have my human rights, you have your human rights, and they are at conflict with each other. And this is quite shocking. If you look at the General Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the freedom of expression is contained there. And this list contains things that we thought were unalterable and could not be turned into their very opposite. There are things that were ignored or violated in the times of National Socialism and Communism. Now these concepts are upheld, but they are being reinterpreted, and this is dangerous. Patrick Dubois, do you see it in the same way? Do we have a question of human rights that
You know, as I told you, I am in different countries on the ground. So, by example, when I am in Iraq, and I will not tell you who, but we went to an international judge in the country because a girl was being raped, sold by somebody very important in ISIS, was in jail. She wanted to be tested, to be witness. And the judge said, okay, but we are in Iraq, and in Iraq there is a Sharia. it's not illegal to rape a slave. So, and the judge is secular. So as long as you live in the same places, when you pass from Paris to Madrid to Berlin, it's okay. We are in the same field. But if you begin to travel to China, you begin to travel to India, where there's a billion of people, suddenly we have to realize we are in a new period. We are in a new period. And for Europe, it's not nice to know it. Imagine we are not invited actually with Lavrov. He didn't invite anybody. The meeting in Paris yesterday gave nothing. Macron welcomed everybody and it was finished. So we try to say, hey, we know everything. We are the human right. In France, of course, with the revolution, we built everything. We are the standard. But suddenly when you are not invited in the screen and you are not in the garden to play, that's our situation. The other thing I would like to mention, we didn't mention it since the beginning, and myself I forgot. Me, I'm very afraid about what happened to the women's rights. I give you an example. When we began in Ukraine, with Bucha, many women have been raped, and we knew it, and it was terrible. Now, complete silence. You cannot tell me how many women have been raped in Ukraine. And in every country the same. When I work in Guatemala, we counted the dead. Suddenly we saw that many of the indigenous women have been raped. You count the dead, you don't count the rapes. So I see in many countries, in one way we say, oh no, it's a freedom for women, we are in a new period, women's rights. But concretely, it doesn't work. Out of the Yazidi, where every woman who has been raped is ready to go to justice, I don't know any other country. It's always called collateral damage. So, first, two answers to your question. First, we cannot actually practice real justice if we don't study geopolitics. Because you can dream. You can dream, we are the king, we have been the king, France is a big colonial country. We have no more colony. It's finished. So, you know, who could imagine that the Karim Khan would be forbidden to go to America? It was unthinkable. But it's not unthinkable, it's done in one day. So we have, unfortunately, to be aware of geopolitics, otherwise we dream a geopolitics behind our computer, but it doesn't exist. So, to study geopolitics is not nice, it's a cold science, without feelings, without question of justice, without all that. It's question, you know, De Gaulle said, at a certain level, a country has only one interest, his own interest. And so, when you are working for justice, you are confronting to national interest in every country, I can tell you, by example, in America, people ask me to work on the mass grave of the Native American. I did it only one time. It was so violent against me, I say, bye-bye. I say that because if you don't realize the weight of geopolitics, you dream. And actually, with the social media, with the TV, with the satellite, geopolitics is mondial. We are no more between Europeans making the music. It's finished. What happens actually seems it's finished. So if we don't wake up to see at a mondial level and we grab to say, no, we are Europe, we have the revolutions, we have Nuremberg, we have everything. Okay, but nobody is listening. It seems old-fashioned, small country. I say that because when you are in America, when you hear that no American will die for Estonia, too small. So imagine the population of Estonia who listen to that. So I would say we need to have a teaching of the law with a realism in geopolitics, with a cold, very cold science. Otherwise, we'll have our values yelling in a corner and nobody will listen. We are in a new period. You know, you see our age. Me, I'm no more young. My students are 18 years old. You know, if I don't teach well, they work on their computer to buy or to chat. Even if I go in back them, I see that they don't close their computer. We are in a new period. We must wake up.
Wir sind in einer
Well, we're living in a new era, a new time, but a time in which we have to think about international law standards. Wolfgang Kalek, how do you view this immediate present time? And what about the international law system? Is it being undermined? Well, it was never unchallenged. International law has never been fully implemented without being challenged. You said that only 5 out of the 2,000 German perpetrators that were involved in the Babin Yar killings were sentenced. This country here was built up after the war by former Nazis, and this was part of Realpolitik. And there was an amnesty for many lawyers who were sentenced in the aftermath of the Second World War. They were all pardoned in the 1950s and 60s. Many crimes have gone unpunished. But we are not just confronted with islands of reason or of justice. And here I would contradict Mr. Müller. The principle that people cannot be killed in en masse and that it is not acceptable for people to be raped en masse. This is an idea, a concept that has become a part of international law. These are principles that are internationally acknowledged. And I can just recall the writings of Habermas, who said that after the US attack on Iraq, this was a moment when people became conscious of this. And I should also like to refer to the torture at Abu Ghraib. The whole world agreed that this was injustice, that this was unacceptable. Of course, there was torture going on in Egypt, in Syria, and elsewhere, but nevertheless, many people around the globe shared this view that this was injustice and that this was unlawful. And many lawyers made this their job and committed themselves to documenting those crimes. We are talking about Ukraine today. We have a very lively civic society in Ukraine. Between 2014 and 2022, this society has learned to use international criminal law, and this is what enabled them to document crimes of war in 2022 when the war of aggression broke out. They were able to document those crimes, even putting their own lives at risk. And when we talk about the global south, let me reiterate, you might be led to think that the criticism from countries in the global south, such as Brazil, South Africa, or India, that this will end in cynicism. They say the West does what they want and they impose their power politics. No, the South African government decided to go to The Hague, to the International Court of Justice, to reproach Israel of genocide. And this has been noted throughout the world. So the next question arises, what happens if this war is continued with these methods? Will this result in frustration or disappointment? But in my view, this is an achievement. You cannot simply say that there are just islands of reason or islands of justice. Nor do I accept the argument that many of the countries or states involved commit human rights violations themselves on their own part. Maybe this is the time where civil societies in the various countries and in the various continents draw attention to these things. The cases in Chechnya were dealt with by a center of lawyers in London. They tried to cooperate with lawyers on the ground, and the same goes for the Kurdish cases. Here again, the lawyers were based in London, and the networks, lawyers' networks have grown, and the time has come to strengthen those networks in order to make sure that states speak up for this international order. Well, the islands need not necessarily be small islands. Mr. Kalek, what do you have in mind? What kind of islands? Well, what we would have in mind is the European Union. We would always tend to think that the European Union is a unique project. It's the maybe only example for a genuine political community with elections and a separate parliament of its own, which is at the same time transnational and which is active in the field of protecting human rights. This is what you would normally think, and I do not want to diminish what has been achieved here. However, I do believe that we have to face up to the fact that we are living on an archipelago, but the water table is rising. If we look at the US, we are losing an international stakeholder. They have always been ambivalent, but now we are losing the United States as an international stakeholder in this field. We have been discussing the European Court of Human Rights and documentation centers and so on and so forth. But I think they respond to human rights violations that have taken place in the past. And they are documenting current human rights violation, and the forecast is bleak because the overall political development that we have now is prone to violence. Violence and force becomes more and more part of the political discussion. That's a phenomenon that we see right now. And wherever there is violence, human rights violations are not far. This is just something that I would like to note. And I should like to subscribe to what Mr. Dubois said. We need to be clever, we need to be smart, we need to be realistic, and we need to give up the big universal ideas. Instead, we need to focus on detail, on small things. Yes, we also live at a time when international legal institutions, such as the International Criminal Court in The Hague, meet with a lot of rejection. In early February, there was this announcement by the US president that he would impose sanctions on members of the ICJ. So these international institutions are under political attack. Angelika Nussberger, you are familiar with the European Court of Human Rights because you used to work there. And what would you say? what is the current status or situation of those institutions in these dramatic times, and what could civil society organizations or national governments do to support those institutions? Because we have achieved a lot after all. What can we do to strengthen these institutions? I think we should also say that the European Human Rights Convention has been around for 75 years, and that's a long time for a convention which has proved to be a very big success. It started small and it became more and more effective. More and more countries acceded. It was just a done thing to become a member of the Human Rights Convention. Azerbaijan acceded because they wanted to be part of it. And these times are over now. Russia has left. Switzerland is upset by the climate-related decisions. The British government thinks of exiting, so it's no longer a taboo to say we leave. And that's the risk that I see also with regard to the United States. They cannot immediately attack this institution, but this general attitude that is opposed to international cooperation in this field, this is a problem for such a fragile institution, because the judges are interfere with national legal systems, and this does not always meet with the approval of the national judges. But the court was considered to be the conscience of Europe, and it has been celebrated as a success. So, as I said before, there is light and shadow. There are opposing powers, diametrically opposed powers that threaten to flood the archipelago. If more states exit, and if it's just a small club of the willing, then we can end up in a very sad situation very soon. But the convention can also turn out to be a bulwark. And I'm with Mr. de Boer here. We can do a lot in order to strengthen this institution and to make sure that it is a bulwark that is not overrun by political forces that are opposed to international jurisdiction. In the present, we become witness of, and we are confronted with crimes against humanity and human rights violations in the unlawful war of aggression waged by Russia against Ukraine. This is the case, for example. This experience of being too late is an experience that we feel constantly. And documenting these crimes is an important task. Patrick Debois and Wolfgang Kalleg are involved in these efforts with their organizations, Yahati Nunum and the ECCHR. Patrick Debois, perhaps you can say a bit more about the way in which you work in Ukraine under the conditions that prevail there. How can you do research work there? Following a Russian missile attack on the railway station in Kramatorsk in the spring of 22, you immediately started to document and reconstruct this crime. How do you work on the ground?
We work in a very on the ground way. It means when there is an attack, like in Kramatorsk or in Kharkiv, people immediately actually build a group by internet, Telegram or something like that. And so it's not, I would say the planet has changed. And so you have not to go to Kramatorsk. You have to enter in the group and find the victims and ask if the victim accept, because the victim, they run away. They are not waiting for you on a chair to be interviewed. They run away because they lost their home. And so you jump, I would say, on the witness, and I would say the people accept to speak, and we make a very long interview, and our interviews for Iraq has been accepted by the courts in Germany. So for Ukraine, you have to, by example, when they say, oh, the Kramatorsk, it was only a train station with militaries. So Putin at the period say, I attack only militaries, I never reach a civilian. But it's enough when you have 3-4 interviews of people in the train station to know it was civilian. When the maternity, you remember the maternity was being attacked, and Trump and when Putin said, no, it was only militaries. You interview people quickly. But I say again, I'm not advocating for your country, but I think you don't realize the particularity of Germany. Me, I traveled a lot. I can tell you, I traveled a lot in the planet. Holocaust was unique. Okay, I accept it. But the reaction of Germany to build a democracy, recognizing genocide have been done in Germany, you are unique. There is no country today where you can go and say, oh, they killed Armenians, do you recognize it? No, you will go to jail. You can go to no country with democracy is like you. So I think you have a unique potential, and I'm afraid as time is passing, but you forget your particularity. You are the only country with that. You know, when I began my work, and we were in the Bundestag, and we were received by people from the different parties, Die Linke, the right, the CDU, and that. I was like mad. I say, in France, it would be impossible to make a meeting with different political parties about Holocaust. It would be impossible, completely. People will run away. So you have a capacity of democracy. And you have a capacity, you have chosen to build without telling you didn't do the genocide. Imagine, there is not one country. I mean, I travel a lot. I travel in Guatemala, I travel in Asia, in China. Go in China, I try to say there is something like that. You will go to jail. So I think you have a unique capacity. So I know we are fragile. I know all the problems actually. But I think you don't use enough your capacity. You know why, when we have a woman who is raped by a Russian, why you are the only country I can bring the person? I cannot even bring to my country. They don't exercise universal competence the same way. Because you took legal initiative in the consequence of the recognition of the genocide that you did. And you are a democracy. We cannot say, oh, Germany is not a democracy. No, it's a democracy. And so I say that because I work with Germans in Guatemala, for example. They are helping us a lot. But they don't use their particularity to say, you know, you don't die when you recognize a genocide. You don't fall in a well. It's not a catastrophe. It's a human rights decision from a country. And you took this decision. I say, but unfortunately, you are the only one on the planet. But you have to teach other countries to say, don't be afraid. 300 years ago, you made a genocide. It's okay. If you recognize it, it will not destroy the country. It will build human rights. So I say that because I have been grown an anti-German by my father, so I'm not a German. But I traveled a lot. I will give you an example. I was in Iraq, and we was in university and in an international symposium about genocides, for all genocides. So I went, I say, unbelievable. It was done by an American institution, so wonderful, except one genocide, the Jews, of course. So, and you cannot even mention it in the discussion. You cannot go in Baghdad and say there were 41% Jews before the war. You cannot, you will go to jail. And everywhere like that. I cannot mention our country because I can tell you I don't want to be arrested. So, but you don't use enough what you built. And now, because you have ultra-right, you have that and that, you can forget the richest choice you have done since the war. They tell me another country recognized they did a genocide and is a free country. Give me another one. I will finish by Costa Rica. Me, I love the animals. So I go to Costa Rica, crocodile, parrots, wonderful monkeys. And suddenly I say, isn't it strange? Because you have no indigenous, and Guatemala, who is just next door, has 68%. The guy, they told me, because we kill them. And I say, can you go to see the mass grave? Oh, he told me, nobody asked me. So we went in the forest and we found a field of mass grave of indigenous, long time ago. But today, if you go to Costa Rica, you will see crocodile, monkeys, forest, swimming pool, but nobody will tell you about the genocide of indigenous. Many countries are built on genocide and mass crimes. At the condition we forget it. At the condition, and you are the only one to have made another choice. The only one, until now. And I think you have a special responsibility in the planet. So don't forget who you are and the way you did since the war. Imagine after Hitler, you have chosen not to forget Hitler. Yeah, I think I would never remember this guy. No, here you can make many memorials, and that you go in Berlin, you see many. It's unique. It's unique. But I think you should try to teach other countries who were confronted to also a genocide to move forward. Because, and you are deeply a democracy, much better than many countries. But I'm afraid that time goes on, people begin to forget where we are and who you are.
Patrick Desbois ist dann auch gleich von der konkreten Arbeit vor Ort.
So Patrick Desbois, from giving us an account of his practical work on the ground, also moved over to the general. And on the European Center for Constitution and Human Rights, Wolfgang Kalik, how do you help victims of crimes against humanity, violations of human rights? Well, we're as good and bad and as bad as the respective civil societies are. So when we are asked, why are you not working on North Korea? We say, well, because North Korea is a closed country, completely sealed off. Our work from Berlin, from Europe, has a number of different approaches and goals. Obviously, we want to change the situation on the ground. And how do we do this? By what we're producing here as regards legal expertise, 200, 300 pages of indictments that will possibly then end up in arrest warrants, that in those countries where these crimes have been committed, acknowledge that the civil society acknowledges them in that particular country, so that there is a certain degree of openness, of open-mindedness. There are a number of positive examples. Let me mention again Argentina, Chile, where the people themselves on the ground collected evidence and then brought this before the Inter-American Court of Justice, but then later on to Europe, to French, Spanish, and also German courts, also here in Nuremberg, tried to instigate legal proceedings, not so much in order to make the Germans, the French, or the Spanish adjudicate those cases, but in order to these cases being taken up by the Argentinian courts, and the Argentinian courts actually did that. And this kind of interdependency. Well, an American researcher once called it Pinochet effect, this sort of ping pong going to and fro between the different fora, for example, was also something that helped in Syria. It's not only looking back, but if you deal with the violence perpetrated by a regime that has collapsed, then I do this, obviously, with the goal of this preventing from ever happening again. And there are studies that in those countries where these state crimes that we're talking about here now, where these have been actually brought to court, that people have tried to come to grips with it, this degree of brutality by the police, by secret services, actually diminished after that. That is something that there's clear evidence for that. So civil society is not only deal with this one issue and only with looking back, and this sort of frozen past, but that we also explain what sort of consequences this may have, and where the sort of context is, to put it into context. But there too, obviously, we always come up to certain limitations. We have limitations as regards our capacity. It's not only too late, but it's always too little. Always and ever. And this is something that we need to address openly. A great experience we had with the Syrians that live in exile here, the Syrian diaspora in our country. We talked about this earlier on. One trial against a colonel in Koblenz who was a torturer, and he was sentenced to 3 years. That is not the end of impunity, obviously, and it's not justice, but it is at least something that gets closer to that. And when we were dealing with this, when we were talking to colleagues, to friends, to the plaintiffs, we came to this overall result. But what is also important in the papers, obviously, it's always said, this is not enough, again, too little, again, too late. No. What's important is that this is a sentence, a verdict that in 22 was actually seen by the Syrians that were still under a dictatorship. And power does not only have an objective, but also a subjective factor. And the subjective factor means, well, all of a sudden, these people seem to be untouchable that are in power, that their power can never be in some way shaken. And this, in a way, once you have such a verdict, it's a bit of a breach in that seemingly impenetrable wall. Some may only think of it as a little scratch, but the sort of stories behind that are obviously also important. For example, those Russians who were in some way embroiled in the Chechen War were no longer allowed to travel, couldn't travel, and didn't travel. Those who were in the Truth and Reconciliation trials did not admit to their actually no longer travel in certain countries. The CIA agents who after 9/11 were indicted for torture were warned to go to Europe. This is of course too little, but it is not nothing, and that is something that we need to understand. That this broad spectrum of silence, of not saying anything. Peter Weiss, the author, once said on the Nazis and their crimes, where obviously there was also this controversy. What can actually these verdicts? What can the courts of law actually do? And is there really some kind of effect? Yes, there is. Between nothing and absolute justice, there is something. And the Auschwitz trial, for example, is a case in point for me. Wonderful. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trial in the 60s. Actually, from a legal point of view, it was they failed. And the way that they worked this out is obviously, well, lends itself to criticism. But it was so important because people, in a way, translated into reality what was said in this court of law. Because Hannah Arendt, Peter Weiss, Kippard actually wrote books about this, scripts about it. It was filmed. So that changed the way that people thought about this. Christoph Möllers, I think you would agree to this, wouldn't you? That civil societies in these documentations are of crucial importance. How important is this detailed work, this groundwork, so to speak? Well, of course it is important. I mean, it's very important. You see, I think a legal system lives of many different factors. It lives because people do this. If Wolfgang Karlik tells us about his work, we learn something about the effectiveness of law. that it is in many ways an achievement of our civilization, that we go beyond political influence and that there are certain universal standards by which we judge certain actions. And in order to give this perhaps a bit of a positive spin, we can do more these days with this than merely, and I'm not saying this in a pejorative way, but these spectacular cases of human rights violations can in some way be shown, because what we're trying to do, when people these days criticize international law by it being undemocratic, they will not respect national law either. So when they make derogatory remarks about international instruments, then quite often, well, they mention certain reasons whether these courts are not legitimate. But in many ways, this is just an excuse and to generally bring into question any kind of legal construct. So the conclusions we draw from this, how does actually human rights laws work? And this is a very fragmentic landscape, obviously, but it's very impressive. And one of the conclusions, one of the lessons we can draw from this is to make it very clear how these proceedings actually work, make it to all of us. Because, and I'm a little bit pessimistic there, maybe this culture of legality seems to be put into question right now. And that's something we as continental Europeans are quite proud of it. But just recently, in a way, it's been limited somehow, or placed under certain limitations, that each and everyone needs to accept that once legality is put into question. Well, Trump is only the tip of the iceberg here when he says, I fight for the common weal of my country, so I can no longer be bound by these laws. I am above the law. I think the bottom line should be that human rights protection is a model that shows us what law can actually do, and also sort of go beyond its mere narrow scope and can actually teach people something. We have a legalistic tradition. We have a pre-democratic legal tradition. We always have abided by certain laws that we thought were a matter of course. These days are not acknowledged all over the world as being a matter of course. Well, we can in many ways, that is true, be a role model of how this can work. So I wanted to give a positive spin on it, as I said. So in many ways, we're looking in a positive way to what we actually have, to a certain legal acquis, but we're having this talk at a time where international conventions are brought into question, attacked, but also a time where broadening the scope of international law to include Russia and its war of aggression against Ukraine. And this war has lasted now for 3 years. And during this conference in Nuremberg, we're also dealing with bringing these cases before a court of law. So what can be done now on these war crimes that are perpetrated currently in Ukraine? Angelika Nussberger, there is a very young initiative by the Council of Europe on setting up a special tribunal on Ukraine. Would this be a possible approach? And is this promising? Will this come to pass? Do you think that this is a possibility to bring these cases, these massive violations of human rights that have occurred ever since 2014 and now particularly during this war of aggression, before a court of law? Well, it's always difficult, and maybe that is in a way the common denominator for our discussion here. What we have as regards a tribunal is simply insufficient because it actually takes the Ukrainian legal system as a basis, but it would not, if we take this as a point of reference, we will not be able to actually bring Putin before court of law. It's not a tribunal that can actually bring together the 193 member states of the United Nations, but it has sort of, these are the European states that are rallying around. And so whether this will happen, will come to pass, depends on all of the members. So it's a bit of a half step, and we don't know whether it will be a full step forward. Is it positive, or is it just a certain degree of activism that is still around? We need to do something at least, but it's not really the right approach or an effective approach. So we don't as yet know. Those who are responsible, obviously, for this, for taking this initiative, simply say we'll try to do that. But right now, I don't really can say with any degree of certainty that this will come to pass. Patrick Dubois, you know the situation in Ukraine very well in the past, but also in the present. What sort of chances do you see that this will finally be in some way be brought before a court of law, these kinds of crimes against humanity? What
For that, since the beginning, I met many times the Ministry of Justice in Kiev. I'm totally not an optimist because actually there is something else. You know, in Germany, as well as we know in France, there is an allergy to international organization, an allergy. And so when you vote, I don't know the result of your votation, but I'm sure that a certain party is not the smallest one. And in France, if we had a free election today, it would be the same. So actually, I believe much more in just judging somebody with a name, with a profession, who did something to an Ukrainian person, because we have the weight of the media. Before, when you judge one person in a court, nobody knew it. The next village didn't know it. Now, with social media, with Facebook, with TikTok, with all what you want, it can spread everywhere. And so if the Russian mothers begin to think, oh, my boy is doing that, come on, I didn't know. Because with the social media, you cross the border. But I don't believe in big international organizations, and I'm afraid to make dream Ukraine of that. I believe much more, you know, how the Soviet began when it was the end of the war. They began trials in 1943. They judged 10 people in Krasnodar, and they advertised that everywhere, with TVs, with that. They were smart. So we have to be as smart of these countries. Actually, I say that when you judge a guy who is a terrorist, who comes back in France, or a mother, she's arrested. Now, after you go to Syria and you meet the French terrorists, they say, oh, we don't want to come back in France because we will be arrested. They know it. But no international court will judge ISIS. Absolutely not. So, me, from Ukraine, I'm much more in favor, because we don't know where the elephants are going. Don't forget, we have a planet of elephants and a free for elephant, because now we see only America and Putin. But if China enters in the game, it will be the really big elephant. And we are no more the big elephant. But we have the social media. When you judge somebody for a crime committed widely by a Russian against population in Ukraine, you can spread everywhere. So also we have to work with PR. We have to make a trial known, not to be secretly done, and that's it. Because nobody now is in that planet. A small trial, strongly done. Why do you think actually the French government has changed to judge the terrorists who come back? Now it's not a few years, it's many years. Why? Because we know there are many others who want to come. And so now they understand it's not a good game. But imagine if we, in France, with all the terrorists that we have, if we called an international court against ISIS, where would we be? Me, I believe much more, and in Germany, I say again, you have this universal competence that you exercise in the largest way that exists. You have a weight. You have a weight. But I say that because I was not the good guy. When I met the Minister of Justice in Ukraine at the beginning, I was in 2 or 3 public conferences with 20 journalists. I was the only one to say, you lose energy in our time. You have not a lot of money. You will lose a lot of people. People turn all over the world to judge Putin. Where are we now? Where are we now with Mr. Putin? Who will forbid him to travel? So, and if Trump reopens the boycott, what will we do? We'll run to Karim Khan and say, hey, stop Trump. No, it's the opposite. I say that because it's sad to say, but when you are judges, you must be extremely realistic about public opinion and impact of what you do. You can have a big impact if you use the social media, if you let the social media work. But if it's closed in a room, that this person has been judged, no wait. But I don't believe in, actually, you don't see that nationalism is coming everywhere in the countries against international organization. Go to France and ask about European Union what they think. You will see. So it's a changing time. But your courts have weight. Me, I know by experience, because with Andrei Omansky we work on that, when the woman, the mother of the guy, will know his son, who is very young, he was raping Ukrainian women publicly, and he's judged for that. I know many of the mothers, they say, is my boy doing the same thing? Is it that the job? Believe in public opinion. But me, I'm very pessimist about international organization because I work in different continents. You know, President Hollande, when it was the beginning of ISIS, he made a meeting with 20 prime ministers from Muslim countries. And me, I was a keynote speaker to speak about the Yazidi. It was a long time ago, so I made a small movie of 5 minutes about what is happening to the Yazidi. And no prime minister raised any question. Because when you are confronted to the big houses today, why don't you think we attack China for genocide, whatever things? People ask me, will you attack? I say, yes, speak to the businessman. So it's sad to say because you have been trained in law, you know everything, but we wake up in a new world. But you have power. Me, I am optimist if the judge believe in their power of influence when he judges somebody.
Aber nicht immer natürlich. Too late again. War Crimes and Fight for Justice, a talk with Angelika Nussberger, Patrick Desbois, Wolfgang Kalek, and Christoph Möllers on the margins of a conference of living humanity here in Nuremberg at this memorial site, 600. This living humanity in dark times comes from a speech of Hannah Arendt that she gave in 1959 when she was awarded a prize in Hamburg. And Christoph Möllers referred to this speech. I can only recommend it to you. The world isn't only humane because it is created by humans, and it is not getting humane because the human voice is heard within it, but only once it has become a topic of the talk. Why do I quote Hannah Arendt? Because we would love to talk to you as well, but unfortunately it is already late, so maybe you will take a little time to stay on during the reception and then have the possibility to talk to our guests. I would like to thank the Federal Agency for Civic Education. I'd like to thank the host, our Higher Regional Court and also the Open Platform Initiative. And I'd like to thank all of our hosts, and I'd like to thank the interpreters and the technicians. So thank you all for being here, showing an interest, and I'd like to thank all of the audience that are connected to us by live stream, and I'd like to thank our guests here on the panelists who've told us a little bit about their work, Angelika Nussberger, Patrick Debois, Wolfgang Kalek, and Christoph Möllers.
Und ich glaube, der Gastgeber sollte noch ansagen, wie es jetzt weitergeht.